1974, a family of four was found strangled inside their own home in Wichita, Kansas. The killer had tied them up, suffocated them, and then sat down at their kitchen table. He ate their food. He watched television. And then he walked out the front door, like nothing had happened. The police had no idea who he was. For the next 30 years, he killed again, and again, and again, and every single time, he got away. But here is what makes this case unlike anything you have ever heard before. This killer did not just want to kill. He wanted to be famous. He wanted the world to know his name. So he wrote letters. He sent packages. He mailed coded clues directly to police and newspapers, taunting them, daring them to catch him. And for 3 decades, nobody could. Until the day he made one mistake. One single digital mistake. And that mistake was hidden inside a floppy disk. This is the story of BTK, the killer who hunted his own capture, and the coded evidence that finally brought him down. Stay with me, because the floppy disk part of this story is something most channels never fully explain. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly how a serial killer who evaded law enforcement for 30 years was undone by metadata that fit on a disk the size of your hand. Welcome to Shadow Cipher Files. Dennis Rader was born in 1,945 inches, Pittsburgh, Kansas. On the surface, he was the most ordinary man you could imagine. He worked at a church. He was a compliance officer who fined people for having tall grass in their yards. He was a husband, a father, a Boy Scout leader, a president of his local congregation. Nobody suspected a thing. But underneath that ordinary surface, something had been building since childhood. Rader himself later told investigators that from a very young age he had what he called dark fantasies. He collected images. He tied himself up. He imagined scenarios of control and dominance. And eventually, those fantasies were no longer enough. On the 15th of January, 1974, Dennis Rader drove to a house on Edgemore Street in Wichita. He had chosen the Otero family at random. He had watched them. He had planned everything. Joseph Otero was 38 years old. His wife Julie was 34. Their son Joey was 9. Their daughter Josephine was 11. Rader cut the phone line. He knocked on the door and forced his way inside. He told the family he was a wanted fugitive who just needed food and a car. He tied them up. He told them everything would be fine. It was not fine. He strangled Joseph, he strangled Julie, he strangled little Joey, and then he took Josephine to the basement, where he hanged her from a pipe. Then he went upstairs. He ate their food. He watched their television, and he left. That day, 4 members of one family were gone, and Dennis Rader had just begun. Over the next 16 years, Rader killed 10 people total. His victims had no connection to each other. No pattern police could easily find. He broke into homes. He cut phone lines. He bound, tortured, and killed. He called it his project. He gave himself a name, BTK, bind, torture, kill, and he made sure the world knew it. In October 1974, a letter was discovered inside a book at the Wichita Public Library. It was addressed to police. Inside, it described the Otero murders in details that only the killer could know. It was filled with spelling errors and strange phrasing. And at the end, the writer asked for a name. He wanted to be known. He wanted recognition. He signed it BTK. This was not a killer trying to hide. This was a killer performing. And that performance would become the key to everything. Over the following years, BTK sent more letters to newspapers, to television stations, to police. Each one contained details of his crimes. Each one taunted investigators. Each one was written in that same strange, almost childlike style, full of errors, full of pride, full of an overwhelming need to be seen. Police tried everything: handwriting analysis, linguistic profiling, geographic mapping. They had a task force. They had tips. They had suspects. They had nothing solid. And then in 1991, the letters stopped. Rader simply went quiet. Police did not know if he was dead, Imprisoned for something else? Or just waiting? He was waiting. For 13 years, BTK said nothing. Life continued. The case went cold. Investigators retired. New detectives took over with boxes full of old evidence and no clear direction. And then, on the 19th of March 2004, a letter arrived at a local television station in Wichita. Inside was a photocopy of a driver's license belonging to a woman named Vicki Wegerly, who had been murdered in 1986. The case had never been officially connected to BTK. Now it was. The letter also contained photographs taken of her body after her death. BTK was back. And now he was angrier, more demanding, more theatrical. Over the next several months, Rader sent package after package. Some were dropped at random locations. Some were left in cereal boxes in grocery stores. Some were taped to stop signs. Each one contained more details, more taunting, more need for recognition. The police were overwhelmed. The media was consumed by it. Wichita was terrified, and Rader was loving every second of it. In one particularly chilling communication, he asked investigators a question that still feels surreal when you read it. He wrote, asking whether a floppy disk could be traced back to him if he sent information on it. The police, through a local newspaper, sent a message back. They said no. They told him a floppy disk could not be traced. They were lying, and Dennis Rader believed them. On the 16th of February, 2005, investigators received a purple floppy disk inside a cereal box left at a Home Depot parking lot in Wichita. Along with the disk was another taunting letter and a doll that had been bound in the way Rader described binding his victims. But it was the floppy disk that changed everything. Detectives at the Wichita Police Department immediately turned the disk over to their digital forensics team. What they found on the disk itself was relatively ordinary. A document, some text, more of BTK's usual communication. But hidden inside that document, invisible to the naked eye, embedded in the digital structure of the file itself, was something Rader never considered. Metadata. When you create a document on a computer, the file does not just contain the words you type. It also contains invisible data about when the file was created, when it was last modified, and in many cases, information about the user who created it and the device they used. The metadata on BTK's floppy disk contained a deleted reference. It had been removed, but not carefully enough. Using forensic recovery software, investigators were able to pull back a fragment of information that Rader had not realized was still there. The document had been last modified by a user named Dennis, and it was associated with Christ Lutheran Church. One search, one church, one name, Dennis Rader. Within days, investigators were building a case. They needed DNA to confirm. Rader's daughter had once had a pap smear performed at a Kansas State University medical clinic, and her medical records were obtained through a court order. DNA from that sample was compared to DNA recovered from one of the original crime scenes. The match was nearly perfect. On the 25th of February 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over in his car near his home in Park City, Kansas. He was arrested without incident. The man who had terrorized Wichita for 30 years, who had killed 10 people, who had taunted police with coded letters and cryptic packages for decades, was taken into custody because he trusted a floppy disk. He was 60 years old. At his sentencing hearing, Rader stood in court and described each of his murders in clinical, almost bureaucratic detail. He used terms he had invented himself. He spoke about his victims as if he were filing a report. There was almost no emotion. There was no real remorse. What came through most clearly was that same overwhelming need to be the center of attention, the same need that had driven him to write letters in the first place. He was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms. Because Kansas had no death penalty at the time of his crimes, he cannot be executed. He is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he will remain for the rest of his life. He is still alive today. Now, I want to talk about the coded letters specifically, because this is the part of the BTK case that most people know about in general terms, but very few people fully understand. Rader's communications were not ciphers in the traditional sense, not like the Zodiac's Z340 where symbols replaced letters in a systematic way. But they were coded in a different and arguably more psychologically complex way. They were coded in behavior, in pattern, in the gaps between what he said and what he meant. Investigators who studied his letters identified consistent linguistic signatures. He always referred to himself in the third person when describing his crimes. He always used the phrase projects to describe murders. He had a specific way of listing details, almost like a checklist, that stayed consistent across 20 years of letters, despite obvious attempts to vary his style. These behavioral codes were what allowed investigators to say with confidence, long before the floppy disk, that all these communications were coming from the same person, that BTK was not multiple killers. That this was one man, living an ordinary life, writing letters in his spare time. But the deepest code in this entire case was the floppy disk itself. Because what Rader encoded into that disk was his own arrogance. His absolute certainty that he was smarter than the people hunting him. He had evaded capture for 3 decades. He had watched technology change around him. He had seen investigators come and go. And he genuinely believed that a floppy disk, a technology he had watched become mainstream, was beyond their ability to analyze. He did not understand metadata. He did not understand that deleting a name from a document does not erase the record of who created it. He did not understand that the digital world he was trying to use as a tool had already been designed to remember. His code was his confidence. And his confidence was cracked by people who understood something he did not. There is one more detail about this case that I think deserves its own moment, because I have not seen it discussed the way it should be. In 2004, when BTK sent that question through a newspaper, asking whether a floppy disk could be traced, investigators made a decision. They chose to deceive him. They printed a response saying the disk was safe. They knew it was not safe. They knew that if he sent one, they had the tools to analyze it. That decision, that single deliberate lie published in a local newspaper, is what broke the case. Think about what that means. 30 years of investigation, hundreds of thousands of dollars, multiple task forces, dozens of detectives, and the thing that finally worked was a lie in a newspaper and a killer who trusted it. BTK spent decades trying to communicate in ways that would let him be known without being caught. He thought he had found the perfect system, a way to have an audience without consequences. And in the end, it was that need for an audience, that compulsion to communicate, that destroyed him. He reached out one too many times, and someone was ready. So what does the BTK case teach us about how coded evidence actually works in criminal investigations? First, it teaches us that codes do not have to use symbols to be codes. Behavioral patterns, linguistic habits, the metadata embedded in a digital file, all of these are forms of encoding that investigators are trained to read. Second, it teaches us that the most dangerous assumption a criminal can make is that they understand the tools they are using better than the people hunting them. Rader had watched technology evolve, but he did not deeply understand it. That gap in understanding became the gap that swallowed him. Third, and maybe most importantly, it teaches us something about the psychology of killers who communicate. BTK is not unique in his need to reach out. The Zodiac did it. The Unabomber did it. The Tylenol killer did it. There is something in a certain profile of violent criminal that cannot tolerate invisibility. They commit crimes for reasons that go beyond the crimes themselves. The crime is almost secondary to the recognition they believe they deserve. And that need for recognition is always a vulnerability. Dennis Rader killed 10 people. He destroyed families. He terrorized a city for 3 decades. He is not a figure to be admired or romanticized in any way. But his case is one of the most forensically important in American criminal history because it showed investigators, for the first time at that scale, how digital metadata could crack a case that traditional methods could not. The techniques used to analyze that floppy disk became training material for law enforcement agencies across the country. The BTK case is now part of the curriculum in forensic digital analysis programs. In a horrible way, the floppy disk changed how we catch killers. If this case has made you think about how many other unsolved crimes might have coded evidence still waiting to be read, I want to tell you that there are more than you might expect. Right now, the FBI has a list of active cases where communications from unknown perpetrators contain patterns and possible codes that have not been fully analyzed. One of those cases is coming to this channel very soon. It involves a dead man, a handwritten note, and a code that the FBI publicly admits it cannot break. The case is from 1999. The note has never been decoded, and I am going to break it down piece by piece in the next video. If you do not want to miss that, make sure you are subscribed and the notification bell is on, because that video is going to go deep into territory that most true crime channels never touch. And if this video gave you something to think about, if it changed how you see the BTK case or how coded evidence works, leave a comment below with the word cipher. I want to know how many of you made it to the end. And I want to hear your theories. Do you think Rader would have been caught eventually without the floppy disk? Or did he come closer to getting away with it than anyone wants to admit? This is Shadow Cipher Files. We go where the codes lead. And the next case goes somewhere very few people have been willing to look. I will see you there.